Our whole universe was in a hot, dense state that nearly 14 billion years ago expansion started. Wait, the earth began to cool, the autotrophs began to drool, Neanderthals developed tools, we built a wall. We built the pyramids, math, science, history, unraveling the mystery that all started with a big bang.
Many years ago, philosophers such as Buddha, Confucius, and Hebrew scholars began to contemplate the connection between minds and bodies. Later, Greek philosophers Socrates and Plato found mind is separate from body, but is born within us. Aristotle continued and learned intelligence is earned, not born. 2,000 years later, René Descartes brought back Socrates and Plato's initial idea. Meanwhile, in England, Francis Bacon was moving science towards experience, and common sense. 50 years later, John Locke wrote an essay saying the mind is born blank and gains thought through the mind. This is shown through Mark Rosenberg's study of the way the brain shows growth with experience. This is called empiricism and occurs when well stimulated at a young age.
Two men, Gibson and Watt, created a study asking whether visual perceptions are inborn or learned. This is a modern way of studying psychology by what Myers defined as experimental psychology. Experimental psychology is when psychologists create experiments with recordable results in a controlled environment. Gibson and Watt did this by creating a visual cliff. The visual cliff only appears to be a cliff. In this study, mothers would stand across the cliff and call their babies to them. Most of the babies wouldn't cross, but by the tested age, children would have already experienced falling and hurting themselves. So, the question is, do we learn from experience, or is it an inborn ability? This study doesn't answer this question, but the visual cliff is still used today as a tool to help people overcome their fear of heights. Nonetheless, this method is better than the previous methods, such as structuralism and functionalism. Functionalists, such as William James, studied down-to-earth emotions, where structuralists, such as Edward Titchener, had people look in on themselves and how they perceive senses. These both created scattered results, and today we have evolved.
Psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes, and it developed long ago from biology and philosophy. Behavior is anything an organism does, while mental processes are any internal experiences. Wundt, a philosopher and physiologist, Freud, who developed the psychoanalytic theory, Watson and Skinner were all important psychologists. Behaviorists thought that science should be rooted in observation since you can't record the mind. B.F. Skinner, a behaviorist, did a study about superstition, studying why people are superstitious. He put animals in a chamber, the Skinner box, and through operant conditioning found that positive reinforcement led to superstitious behaviors. In and after the 1960s, humanistic psychology switched from putting an emphasis on potential for personal growth to cognitive neuroscience, which emphasized the study of brain activity linked to cognition. Now, psychology is growing and globalizing, and 500,000 trained psychologists all over the world are changing the field of modern-day psychology and improving it for the better.
Through a biological approach, this person acting nervous might be looked at to discover what in their brain causes their face to become flushed and their hands to be clammy. They also might look at this gene that might have been passed down. Through an evolutionary approach, one might research how this nervousness could have helped the survivals of our ancestors in the past. Someone using a psychodynamic approach might view this person's temperament as an unconscious behavior towards certain situations. With a behavioral approach, one would try to figure out what situations trigger this person's anxiety. A cognitive psychologist might look at the situation and study how this person's interpretation of the situation and how that is affecting their behavior. A humanistic viewpoint might study how this person's anxiety affects their potential for growth and feelings of self-fulfillment. A social cultural psychologist might try to study how anxiety can vary with different cultures and situations. All of these levels of analysis can work together to create a more solid understanding of psychology, known as the biopsychosocial approach. In one study called Thanks for the Memories, leading questions were found to change people's memories of events. This can be explained by both cognitive or biological approaches.
Two different types of psychology are counseling and clinical. Counseling is when someone helps you with problems in life. And clinical psychologists help people with psychological disorders. A human factors psychologist studies how humans interact with machines, and then figure out how to design machines safely and easily accessible. If we take a look at two identical twins who were raised in the same home, we can see similarities in personality. The nature-nurture issue takes into account your genetic makeup and personal experiences. These factors create your psychological traits and behaviors. I chose social psychology because I was interested in human interaction and how we view and affect one another. I loved studying personality psychology because I was interested in consistent traits of people.
Being an educational psychologist, I study how people learn and teach.
As a developmental psychologist, I study the change of ability from the time someone is born to the time they die.